It comes to the three major philosophies as well as Hindu tradition in general. He has written a few books related to this topic, particularly on Hindu theology and Bhagavata and contemporary theory. He's won an award as well in 2011 on theological promise from the Heidelberg University, I think it's in Germany, and the Templeton Foundation. Give him a big hand. He's going to focus on a little bit a variation of, other than the three philosophies, Dvaita, Advaita, and Vishishta Advaita. He's going to focus a little bit different, but he's going to talk about the Gaudiya Vaishnavism, which probably you all know is the Hare Rama, Hare Krishna, ISKCON kind of Vaishnavism. Okay, we have a lot to learn from all these different things. So take it with an open heart.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. This is a really great pleasure for me to be here. And I have for many, many years thought that these sorts of events are so important. And I'm really glad to be here. And I really appreciate that the organizers have put this together and that I can have the opportunity to be in such a wonderful, wonderful Sangha. This is really beautiful people. I'm going to be talking about Gaudiya Vaishnavism. I'm essentially a student of Bhagavata Purana and a commentarial tradition that begins sort of with Sridhar Swami and Jiva Goswami, and that's mainly what I study. Unfortunately, I do not know as much about Madhva and the Dvaita Vedanta tradition as I would like. But I'm going to mainly be coming from this Gaudiya Vaishnava perspective, and I'll talk about what that means in a minute. If you could slide forward. A lot of what I'm going to be talking about is from a book that I've written, Hindu Theology and Biology. Next slide, please. So these are the topics I'd like to cover. Definitions of physicalism. And this is a dominant philosophy of the human person and the human consciousness, all consciousness for that matter, that I'll discuss. I'll look at arguments for reductionism or physicalism from neuroscience and from Darwinism. I'll look at what the Bhagavata Purana says on consciousness, or Atman, or Purusha, or various words that are used. I'll look at what Jiva Goswami from the 16th century, he lived in Vrindavana, in North India. I'll look at what he says about the relationship of consciousness and the mind-body complex, the mano dehendriya. And then I'll give what I will consider a reply from Jiva Goswami and the Bhagavata Purana's perspective to this dominant philosophical view called physicalism or reductionism. It's dominant in the West today. And I think in some ways it was dominant in India as well. Next slide, please. So definitions of physicalism. Physicalism states that all objects or states or conditions supervene on matter, or they are a consequence of or established by matter. Whatever exists, whether it's the human consciousness, the human mind, emotion, thought, anything that exists, it in some way is rooted in matter. It can't be separated from physical things such as the brain and the body. The mind, consciousness, or psychological states are identical to, dependent upon, or caused by neurological states. Whatever is happening in our subjective awareness, I'm feeling happy or I'm feeling sad, I enjoy eating wonderful prasad, I love seeing the deity, whatever we are thinking and feeling, that in some way fully depends upon the brain. This is one definition of physicalism. The mind, thoughts, perceptions, consciousness, etc. can be explained by or reduced to more fundamental scientific theories about the brain. We can explain consciousness simply by explaining how consciousness arises in and through the brain. Next slide, please. Physicalism in Indian thought. There's a dominant school called Charvaka, which would be considered physicalistic. Someone like C. Mackenzie Brown, a scholar of Darwinism and Hinduism, said, Darwinian evolution will force Hindus to accept Charvaka. Chakravarti Ramprasad and Janardhan Ganeri, two very well-known scholars here in the West, argued that Yogacara Buddhists like Vasubandhu and Asanga, these are founders of a school of Buddhism called Yogacara. They were reductionists since they argued that there are no persons, thinkers, or agents beyond the skandhas. One could argue that in some ways Buddhism, such a powerful school of thought all throughout India, is saying that whatever the Atman, whatever our false notion of the Atman is, it is in some ways rooted in matter, what they call the skandhas. So my question might be, how relevant to contemporary scientific physicalism are the criticisms of Kshanikavada, one of the dominant Buddhist schools of thought from Nyaya, for example, Udayana's Atma Tattva Viveka, or Shankara's criticism of Vijnanavada in the Brahma Sutra? Within Hinduism, we have these sort of powerful critiques of Buddhism from majorly thinkers like Udayana and Shankara and others, and of course Madhva as well, I'm sure, had his own powerful criticisms. How relevant are those philosophies in responding to Western forms of physicalism? That's a question I think about a lot. Next slide, please. So here's an argument for physicalism from neuroscience. This is from Patricia Churchland, from a book called Consciousness at the Crossroads. We should reject non-physical theories of consciousness, such as the idea of the Atman in Hinduism. Because by administering specific drugs, we can change a person's perceptions or change their capacity to remember things. These observations suggest that there is a close relationship between particular chemical substances, particular psychological states, and particular brain states. Indeed, the relation is probably one of identity. The argument is that because we know so much about how to change the chemistry of the brain and the composition of the brain, and that fundamentally changes the way that we think, feel, remember, there must be a dependent relationship between the brain and consciousness, or the self. Next slide, please. Here's a common example. I don't know if you can see it, but these strips here, black all the way to white, it looks like, if we had a very clear picture, you'd see that it looks like the images are unevenly shaded, but they're actually evenly shaded. Why do we see it in an uneven way? It's because of the way that our eyes and our optic nerve interpret external sense data. And we can explain the nature of the nature of our perception by reducing it to an understanding of the eyeball, the ganglia, the optic nerve, and the way the brain processes information. This is a reductionistic argument. From Darwinism, in The Descent of Man, which he wrote in 1871, Darwin argued that man's intellectual capacities, for example, our use of language, and our moral sensibilities emerged in and through evolution by natural selection and sexual selection. There's a very naturalistic process that gave rise to our ability to use language and to think in a moral way. Thus, many have argued that mind and consciousness is not injected into the world or separate from the physical processes of evolution. These are some of the dominant arguments. My argument that I want to talk about here is that the Bhagavata Purana's ontology, or its conception of being, its tattva, with Jiva Goswami's interpretation, can be used to reinterpret the findings of contemporary biology in non-physicalistic or non-reductionistic terms. So this is a very crude overview, but the Bhagavata argues, similar to another school called Samkhya and Yoga, that there's 24 tattvas, 24 parts or constituents of matter. There's 5 gross elements, the things we see, 5 potential elements, the mental elements, mind, intellect, ego, manas, buddhi, ahankara, and what they call chitta, sort of the combination of all of these 3 together. We have sense perception, like ability to hear, taste, see, and so forth. And then we have action. We can speak, grasp, move. So this is a standard sort of Sankhya perspective. Next slide, please. For the Bhagavata Purana, consciousness, or the Purusha, is totally different from matter. And matter including both a mental or intellectual component as well as the physical body. Consciousness gets attached to the mind-body complex by identification, the ahankara. The ahankara is what connects the non-physical consciousness, or the purusha, to the dehadi, the body, and so forth. And ahankara is a function of matter. It's a principle within matter itself. So this little picture that my wife made for me. Next slide, please. We've got the purusha, or consciousness. We've got the external world over on your right. And then the physical and subtle bodies, the stula and sukshma shariras, mediating between the physical world and purusha, consciousness. For Jiva Goswami, who lived in the 16th century in North India and Vrindavana, a disciple or a follower of Chaitanya, and one of the leading thinkers in the Chaitanya Vaishnava or Gaudiya Vaishnava school, he said that the Atman has inherent capacities that are only activated in and through a connection with a material body, a pancha bhautika deha, or a spiritual body. We can have two types of bodies, a physical body or a spiritual body, but it's only with the body that the Atman is able to do things. Next slide, please. He quotes Jamatri Muni, a Sri Vaishnava scholar. I've never been able to find this quote in Jamatri Muni's work. But he says the Atman is awareness that pervades the body. It is the nature of consciousness and bliss. It is the referent of the word I. When we say I, we're referring to the Atman. There is a different self in each body, different Atman in each body. It's indivisible, can't be broken down into other parts. It is eternally pure. Furthermore, it has the intrinsic characteristics of apprehension, agency, and qualitative experience. The ability to understand, the ability to do things, and the ability to have bhoktritva, to feel about the quality of things, to feel the qualities of things. These are the qualities for Jiva Goswami of the soul itself, of the Atman itself. This is from his book called the Paramatma Sandarbha, section 19. It's been published by Haridas Shastri in Sanskrit in 1984. He also writes this in the Paramatma Sandarbha, that although the pure self, or the Atman, the Shuddha, has the innate power of agency, although it can do things, nevertheless, when it is conflated or merged with Brahman, the power of agency is internalized because of the non-connection with the body and the mind, the connections with karma, and because of the coverings caused by the bliss of Brahman. When, as Shankara said, or Advaita Vedanta says, the Atman goes into Brahman, Brahmaikya, Jiva Goswami thought that the capacities of the soul were lost. That much we can agree upon. He's agreeing with Shankara and Advaita Vedanta in this point. But, he says, and he who is possessed of the internal power, this is the Chit Shakti, this is the power of Bhagavan, that relates directly to bhakti. And he who is possessed of the internal power, the Chit Shakti, in the form of Bhagavat Bhakti. When you have devotion for the Lord, you get the Chit Shakti, the power of the Lord that provides you with closeness to the Lord. So I start over. And he who is possessed of the internal power, the Chit Shakti, in the form of Bhagavat Bhakti, and he who attains a spiritual body as a companion of the Lord that is qualified by a particular function of the internal power, the Chit Shakti, they possess agency for the service of the Lord, but it is not predominated by matter. He wanted to argue that there's a world called Vaikuntha, in which the soul, the Atman, takes on a spiritual body, and it's able to exercise its nija dharma of kartritva, its innate ability to do things. Next slide, please. This is a graph that I made with my teacher, Satyanarayan Das Babaji. What we have here is on the left-hand side, all the nija dharmas of the Purusha. Self-luminous, unchanging, bliss, so on and so forth. When the self the Atman gets connected with the body. It can apprehend, it can understand, it can do, it can act, but only when it's in connection with the body. This seems to be his point. I don't know what Madhva says on this. It's a very interesting topic. Here's where I'm going to start to engage again with physicalism. This is a picture from a well-known book about consciousness in Western philosophy. There's the outside world, there's a dog and a man. That image hits the optic nerve of your eyeball. The brain processes that information in very complex ways, which we're starting to understand, and that gives you the conscious experience of a dog. For Western neuroscience, for the most part, that's it. You don't need anything more than an external world and a brain in order to have consciousness, a conscious perceptual experience. I think there's other ways of understanding this picture. Jiva Goswami, in another book he wrote called the Tattva Sandarbha, he argues that the consciousness of the jiva is different from the life air, from the prana and the body, but it follows after or accompanies the life air, the prana, wherever it goes. The Atman's always connected with some type of body. Yet it is cognized as moving along with matter's transformations. We understand things. Although the Jiva Goswami's most important students, Vishwanath Chakravartin, was born in Bengal but lives in Vrindavan for most of his life. He wrote a wonderful commentary on the Bhagavata Purana called the Sarartha Darshini. And he argues as follows. He says that flowers are real, flowers sitting here, and the sky is real. But the idea of a sky flower, there being a flower in the sky, that's false. It doesn't exist. There's a very common example. Or also sometimes horns, like on a deer, they're real, and rabbits are real. But the idea of a rabbit having horns, that makes no sense. It's not possible. He said likewise, the dehadi, the body and so forth, they're real. The physical body that we have is not an illusion or untrue for Vishwanath. And the Atmans are real, the souls are real. But he says that Shastra says that the dehadi, or the physical body, is a falsity, or a mithya, because there's no connection between them. When Shastra says, sarvamidam mithyam, everything here is false, it's not that the world doesn't exist and the Atmans don't exist, it's that they don't exist in a permanent relationship, in the same way that sky and flowers don't have a real relationship with one another. Thus, the Atman's connection with the dehadi is with the physical body and so forth is mithya, but not the body itself. The argument that I would like to make from this is not really a formal argument that you might find in Nyaya, but a different way of seeing neurological science. A different darshana, maybe, with a different way of seeing it. One that engages both the Bhagavata Purana and Western science. There's maybe a different way of looking at this. Maybe we can understand it as follows. Evolutionary biological theory is an examination of the manner in which consciousness, or the Atman, observes the continually evolving physical body. The theory of evolution, which so dominates Western thought, it pervades every understanding of everything, from the use of language to morality to culture and the development of science. It just underpins our whole understanding of our past. Is there a way to reconcile the Atma view of the world with that?
Maybe we can understand that what's happening when creatures evolve is that it's different ways that the Atma is identifying with different bodies over time as they change. In this case, the Atman's innate capacities, its dharmas or its shaktis, are realized or manifest in accord with the capacities of the physical body. I think one of the implications of Jiva Goswami's view is that the Atman only becomes fully itself when it has a body that can facilitate it. That the physical body is really quite fundamental to the Atman becoming all that it can be. So you might look at the process of evolution starting from very simple creatures as one in which the innate capacities of the Atman, the Nija dharmas, were only manifest, were only shown in a very, very limited way. Whereas in the human form, they're shown much more directly. Much more of the innate capacities of the soul are expressed. And it can be exciting to think that maybe we can develop them more. We can make the body, culture, and everything better so that the soul, the Atman, can express itself more fully. Another way of looking at neuroscience is this third point here. The correlations between the mind, manas, and the brain found in neuroscience are the interactions between two forms of matter, the stula and the sukshma, as perceived by the Atman. Neuroscience, and I'm going to imagine that many of you work with in neuroscience. I'm going to imagine that many of you do a lot of the computational work that has facilitated mapping the brain in three-dimensional images. At my university, we have a massive computer. It's the fifth largest computer in the world. It take up half this room. It processes trillions and trillions of bits of information every second. And one of the things they're using it for is to make three-dimensional maps of the brain in real time. So that you perceive something, you immediately see how that perception affects blood flow, chemical flow in the brain. The neuroscientists want to say because the relationship between what's happening in the brain and what happens in our subjective experience, because those things are so closely knit together, they must be the very same thing. Maybe there's a different way of looking at it that says that what's going on in the study of neuroscience, neuroscientific research, is a study of how the stula rupa, the gross physical body, and the sukshma rupa, sukshma deha, relate with one another. How the gross and subtle forms of matter are relating with one another. And the Atman is simply observing both of those aspects of reality and interacting with them in certain ways, which is complicated. On this view, the body activates the Nija dharmas, or the innate capacities of the Atman, in various degrees and in various ways, yet it's different from the body. Again, this is no reason to actually believe in the Atman in a philosophical way. That maybe is why we want to turn to someone like Udayana, who I'm familiar with, and maybe I'm going to imagine that people like Vyasa Tirtha and others really talked about Udayana. I don't know, but I would imagine that the school of Navanyaya so took over and influenced all the Hindu schools. But maybe we could turn to someone like Atman, to Udayana, to look at why would one want to believe in this thing called the Atman. So that's my point. Thank you very much. And I put this picture here because I'm really excited that this gathering of people has come together, and I wanted to thank you for having me.